She's been crooked from the beginning, and to think that she has a shot at being our president, crooked Hillary Clinton. We can't let it happen.
Next on Newsmax Prime, New York votes tomorrow, but prior to that primary, Republican frontrunner Donald Trump looks ahead to November. Will his sobriquet, Crooked Hillary, stick to Secretary Clinton? We'll talk about it. Then, the Citadel stuck in controversy. Should that South Carolina military school allow cadets who are female and Muslim to make a change in the way they wear their uniforms? And the change President Obama seeks in immigration law. The Supreme Court hears arguments in that case, and you'll hear my take on the right course of action as Newsmax Prime starts right now. Good evening and welcome to the Monday night edition of Newsmax Prime. I'm J.D. Hayworth. Of prime interest tonight, a New York state of mind. The Empire State holds its presidential primary tomorrow, and polling indicates that New York native Donald Trump should win big in the GOP contest. But over the weekend, Wyoming awarded all of its delegates to Ted Cruz in what critics called yet another voterless victory. Of even greater concern to the Trump team, goings-on in Georgia, where the frontrunner won the primary, but where subsequent actions may actually take delegates away from the Donald. Miranda Kahn on more about what has made the Peach State less than peachy for Mr. Trump and why the Donald may dominate tomorrow's primary in New York.
JD, Trump campaign national delegate director Brian Jack expressed his frustration yesterday to Breitbart, saying Senator Ted Cruz and his campaign staged a coordinated attack in Georgia that led to pro-Trump delegate candidates being challenged in every portion of that state. And that's a state Mr. Trump won in the primary back on March 1st. This latest delegate drama, of course, led to more rallying against the political machine by Donald Trump. Here he is from his rally in Poughkeepsie, New York on Saturday.
We're winning by a lot. We have a very, very big vote coming up on Tuesday. That vote is so vital, and we have to win by big numbers because we have a system that's absolutely rigged. I could have gone out to Colorado. I'm sure I could have met the head guy. I'm sure I could have wined him and dined him and taken him to Mar-a-Lago and put him on private planes, sent him all over the place, which is legal, but that's not democracy. You know, you're allowed essentially to pay off these people. You're allowed to pay off these delegates. And again, we want to be smart. We want to be fair, and it shouldn't be allowed.
Now, Senator Cruz responded to the delegate debate this morning while appearing on a town hall on ABC's Good Morning America.
In all likelihood, we're going to go into a contested convention, which means nobody has a majority. And I'll have a ton of delegates, he'll have a ton of delegates. And it's going to be a battle in Cleveland to see who can get to a majority. You can't get the nomination without earning a majority of the delegates elected by the people. And I believe Donald's highest total will be on that first ballot, and he will go steadily down because Donald cannot win, and we don't want to nominate someone who's a loser in November.
And a little more than 25 hours from now, we should have results from the New York primary coming in with Donald Trump holding a commanding lead to earn most of the Empire State's 95 delegates. Now, some pundits still say he has a chance to win the nomination on the first ballot with 1,237 delegates. But others insist there's a strong possibility of a contested convention. If that happens, it could lead to a real consternation, and a divided GOP could face defeat from the Democrats come November. JD, back to you.
Thanks, Miranda. For more on this story, we're pleased to be joined by our panel. First, Skyping in from New York City, the former Lieutenant Governor of the Empire State, Betsy McCaughey. Skyping in from Northern Virginia, presidential historian Craig Shirley. Craig is also the president of Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs. And Craig is also the author of several biographies on Ronald Reagan, his latest, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. And Skyping in from further south, specifically from St. Petersburg, Florida, pollster Matt Towery. Matt is also the author of Newsvesting, using news and opinion to grow your personal wealth. Thank you all for your time tonight here on Newsmax Prime. So the primary starts bright and early, maybe dark and early tomorrow morning in New York. And Donald Trump looks like he's going to be the big winner, up more than 30 points in the latest Real Clear Politics average of all the polls. But will that be enough to get him close to the magic number he needs to win the Republican nomination on the first ballot? Betsy, ladies first.
Well, it's hard to say whether he will get the magic number, but a big win in New York will build his momentum, and then he goes into other states on the East Coast where he's favored to have equally big wins, including Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And then it's a little less certain in the Midwest, Indiana, for example. And then the other big deciding moment is the race in California.
Well, Matt, Cruz and Kasich are looking to win delegates with a group you might not expect would ordinarily get a lot of attention in a Republican primary: Jewish voters in congressional districts that are decidedly Democrat. The method to that type of appeal, Matt?
Well, Betsy's the expert on New York. I'm not. But in general, in the past, the Republican Party, there's been a strong affinity among Christian conservatives in the Republican Party towards members of the Jewish faith and towards Israel. And I think in particular, I would think that Cruz is trying to tap into that segment. He feels like some misstatements by Trump in the last few weeks might have offended some of his Jewish supporters. Even in New York. I don't know if that's the case. I haven't polled it. I haven't looked at it, but I know that's the play and the angle that Cruz is going after. Kasich is simply trying to get the residue of what sort of the folks who live outside of Manhattan might feel like some of the suburbanites in these other cities we see, where they're just not wild about Trump's style.
Actually, Kasich is
go ahead, Betsy.
Expected to do better in Manhattan than any other part of the state.
Okay, we're going to see it all come out in the wash tomorrow. And for some historical perspective to the here and now, let's call on Craig Shirley. Craig, all this talk about a, quote, rigged system. Trump is still trying to do what is pretty straightforward: get enough delegates before the summer convention to win the nomination outright. But some folks are saying that carries a real risk, because if he falls short, his rantings against the party are likely to annoy the delegates who would be selecting on a second ballot. Do you agree with that scenario?
I agree that the system is complicated. It reminds me of what was once said about the Panama Canal, is that we stole it fair and square, is that yes, the system is complicated. Yes, it favors the insiders. Yes, it favors the local operators. But it is as it is. JD is that Trump should have known how those states out west work, how Colorado and Wyoming work. He should have had people on the ground. He certainly had enough time to organize, read the rules, get people. He certainly got the money. Is that he can only define himself by attacking the establishment up to a point. And that point is that where the establishment becomes more favorable to the average voter and to the average delegate than he does. And that's the real risk right now, is that if he makes himself more unpopular to Republican delegates than the establishment itself, then that's the point where he's going to start losing.
Here is something else we need to talk about. It's almost a meeting of the X's, so to speak. Former Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney scheduled on the new radio show hosted by David Gregory for this coming Friday. David, of course, the former host of NBC's Meet the Press. David asked Mitt about whether or not there will be a contested convention. Let's listen to Governor Romney, then get your reaction.
I think that depends on whether or not Mr. Cruz and Mr. Kasich both stay in the race aggressively through California. If they're both going at it aggressively right until the very end, then I think it's very likely that Mr. Trump wins on the first ballot.
Matt Towery, do you agree with that assessment?
I don't know. I haven't paid much attention to anything Mitt Romney said this year, because he's been wrong so many times. One thing I do say, and I want to interject this, I chaired a Georgia Republican convention many years ago. And to Craig's point, they aren't rigged, but they do lean towards the establishment. And that will also be the case when you get to this big convention up in Cleveland. So I think whether you have Kasich get in or out, I don't necessarily think that's going to resolve this. We may see Donald Trump shy of the numbers he needs, and as Craig alluded, he's going to upset these delegates at some point to the point that you get to a second and third round, they're going to bolt, especially after what
Excuse me, but it is rigged. I can say that as an experienced politician, and when I go to GOP dinners where I go all the time, everybody knows it's rigged. The public is outraged that it's rigged. You don't get to be a delegate unless you're an insider, and those people should not be selecting the President of the United States. It is rigged.
Well, let me just say one thing. This is nothing new in Republican primary politics.
It doesn't matter whether it's new. It's an outrage.
In 1976, Reagan took 45% of the delegate vote of the primary vote in Wisconsin, and yet he came away with no delegates whatsoever because his campaign didn't read the rules and didn't follow the procedures to file the necessary slate. So he got 45%, and yet he got no delegates whatsoever. It was even worse in Ohio. It was even worse in Ohio because in '76 they had 97 delegates going to the Republican National Convention, and yet Reagan only came away with 5 out of 97 because his campaign didn't properly read and prepare the campaign to win the enough delegate votes there.
Betsy, to your point, I agree in this sense. The convention I chaired, there were rumors it was rigged, and it was. And I flipped a coin to make the ultimate decision. Now, no one liked it at the time, but we probably had the most honest convention we've ever had in the GOP in Georgia. So, yes, it is to an extent rigged because the chairs and the people who run things are longtime establishment folks who are going to rule in the direction of the establishment. To that extent, you're right.
And Betsy, you want a final word here?
To defend this, they're going to lose the voters, and that'll be the end of it.
And I have some thoughts coming up later in this program about the whole notion of conventions being rigged and really what has happened with the advent of the internet and individual empowerment and people answering on instant polls and saying, wait a minute, here's where I have my direct point of view. It is worth noting, as has been pointed out by constitutional scholars, ours is a republic, not a direct democracy, and yet when it comes to the practice of selecting nominees, you've got a situation where there are rules in place and you have to reconcile those rules with the way you get the delegates, and that's what's creating so much of the controversy right now. Just the way I see it. More of the way I see it on a different subject later, and what you will see here tomorrow night for coverage of the New York primary. Our coverage of America Votes begins at 8 p.m. Eastern, as I'll be on the anchor desk. Will be followed by Dennis Michael Lynch and Steve Malzberg, and then Ed Berliner back at 10, and at 11 o'clock, a special 1-hour program. I'll be taking your calls live on the air. That's tomorrow night at 11 Eastern, 8 o'clock Pacific. Coming back more with Betsy and Matt and Craig Shirley as this edition of Newsmax Prime continues.